Okay, so I'm just thinking out loud how to name some, like, let's say, lessons or lectures that would structure, I guess, the dissemination of my research and sort of original thesis to some degree. So, I mean, in some sense, it's heavily sort of correspondent with Jung's table of tetralogies, which is somewhat covered in the book Platonism and Alchemy by Carl Jung. And so, you know, in some sense, I think that I could also label my whole system as the recovery of spiritual alchemy, or the recovery of alchemical philosophy and metaphysics. To sort of return psychology as the queen of the sciences, but a new kind of psychology that is in some sense grounded in philosophy, and perhaps a kind of philosophy that's capable of having a kind of moral philosophical edifice and undergirding structure to it. So the thing here then is okay, so I was just thinking of a title for something which would be something like The Foundation of Deep Psychology, which would be the 17 model, in which you would kind of explore the green sequence and the red sequence. And I was just thinking in my head, should I change the green sequence into the blue sequence to be more alchemically faithful in some sense, because the red sequence and the green sequence is probably the exact same concept as the magnetic fluid and the electric fluid being the red and the magnetic fluid being the green. But anyway, but in some sense, to call it a fluid is also perhaps not entirely correct, because in these sequences, they are not just fluid, although they do flow from one to the other in some way, but that this fluid then, you know, within the sequence is, like, let's say, a gas, a liquid, and a solid. And in some sense, the electric fluid solid is different in property to the magnetic fluid solid. And so that they each have quite a distinct sort of characteristic, even within those sort of archetypal categories of, you know, sort of gas, liquid, solid. But you know, the electric fluid gets into a fixed point in which essentially the density of the entire fluid can literally contract into a single point or reach a certain fixed point. Whereas the magnetic fluid is literally like a magnetic field in some sense. So the point is kind of in inscription or in encircling. I can't think of the exact word, but essentially, you know, it's like a rim. It's like a field is probably maybe that, you know. So in some sense, the solid of the magnetic fluid is a field, not a point. So that's an interesting sort of thing. And you can also break that down in relation to one another. In some sense, they only can be defined in relation to one another, because in some sense, the fluid electric, or the liquid electric, is also, in some sense, from the other perspective, is the magnetic field. And so that might be a perfect sort of physical metaphor. And, you know, in some sense, this was also the alchemical exploration into the physical, you know, sort of material domain or natural domain, was to, in some sense, discover metaphor and sort of classical categorical classification of phenomena that then could be, in some sense, put into the philosophical machine of the Philosopher's Stone. But anyway, the magnum opus of alchemical exploration, and as alchemy was the father of psychology, was the father of chemistry, was the But you know, chemistry is even, I think it's lost its understanding of what it in fact means. I mean, and its name has become defunct. But the alchemy, and alchemy is from kemet, the dark soil. And in some sense, you know, in even the alchemical tradition, the idea is that the name itself was inherited from a kind of historical, you know, it's almost like it was inherited from a religious substrate, which was, you know, even perhaps kept at arm's length from the field itself. But the dark soil, the fertile soil, is perhaps in Kemet, in the land of Kemet in Egypt, you know, was a very sort of interesting, sort of strange freak of nature, that, you know, you would have the Nile, which would bring its dark soil. When the Nile flooded, it would be left on what would be the flood bank. And that was, you know, a force of nature, which was a subset of a whole congruence of many processes in weather and nature and season. It was a form of sort of a natural metaphor, but also the idea is that where does this dark soil come from? That it is, in some sense, the excretion from life. It is not life, but it comes from life, and it is in the middle and the beginning of the life cycle, at least in the human enjoyment. I don't want to use this word pejoratively. In the human exploitation of the cycle of things, of the circle of life, essentially. And, you know, there is something very deep about the dark soil being representative of the entire circle, that it's something in the middle. Anyway, this is almost like poetry, but the point here is that there is even a correspondence with this and the ninth dimension, which is in the middle of the 17 model. 9 is exactly in the middle of 17. Which is something like the dark soil of discerning, the door to heaven, the gateway to the heavenly perspective, the heavenly, because heaven is, in some sense, requires how you behold it, how you read it, how you, in some sense, perhaps how you even interpret it, but in some sense, proper discerning is not interpretation, it is sight. It is a truer sight than the natural sight. You know, and somewhat bears resemblance to the idea that the Greek idea of sight was not something that reached the eye, but was something that that vision extended from the eye outwards. And that is even very much linked in material form to the dark soil. The residue of life, in the middle of life, that is the beginning of the circle. And being in the middle, being in the core, in the center of things, in the midst of the garden in some way, what is the boundary of the garden? And this, in some sense, was essentially the beginning of forbidden knowledge, that you do not think outside of the Ouroboros, because the Ouroboros is the bounded mystery that if you put discerning beyond the boundary, beyond the limit of discerning, then you have broken the middle, you've broken the circle of life. And there's this basic moral claim that's in this, which is that the knife of discerning is a sword that can cut itself to death, even if it's improperly used. And so, you know, the analogy of the dark soil has also, you know, its own curse and its own blessing within it. Is that if you do it wrong, well, you know, you might lead to death, but that death leads to the residue of life, and the residue of life is something like the dark soil. So, in some sense, the folly of one is the blessing of another, in some sense. In the circle, and in some sense, you can't think outside the circle. It is forbidden to think outside the circle of life. That there is some other, then you've literally broken, you've devalued the only thing that you have, in some sense, or the thing that at least everything seems to be reducible to. But when it's reducible to it, it's not a decomposition, because in some sense the dark soil is the beginning of the circle, but it's also in the middle of the circle, because life already excreted it, life already produced it. It is the leftover of something that was already alive. And maybe that life is not there, but in the promise of the dark soil there is fecundity, fertility, there is an organic propensity for, well, at least if there's dry land, for it to be something like, in modern parlance, a petri dish. Anyway, so maybe that's an interesting question. I haven't even thought about that. Is what is the middle between the two sequences, between the magnetic fluid and the electric fluid in dimension 9? Where's the actual sort of midpoint? And in some sense, it's probably not two. It's a segment that you have to kind of cut between two gendered poles to find the midpoint between those two poles, because if you have the green sequence and the red sequence, you've got sort of 4 distinct items. So you've got 2 on one side, 2 on the other side, or the immediate ones that are immediately adjacent to one another, you've got 1 on one side and 1 on the other side. And then also the one implies something about the other, and the other implies something about the first. Because what is to the left of the midpoint is also used by the other sequence in a different role. So in some sense, you still even can't get away from the 4, even if you just look at the 2, because there's still, let's say, there's a repurposing happening there. Anyway, let me go. Let me continue my thread. I just thought, I had a conversation last night which was about medicine, and well, it segued into medicine. I was talking about how science has kind of hit a brick wall. That, you know, in the deepest level of science, I would say there's been no progress in about 80 years. And in, you know, just in terms of being able to make discoveries that are actually significant in some sense in the project of science of uncovering something about reality, it's been stale for a very, very long time and stagnant. And in some sense, all the nice technological magic that we get out of science, I mean, pretty much all the components that we use, like in theory, already were plausible and viable from the science that we had from 80 years ago. But, you know, you could say that in some sense the proper or the higher understanding of these things leads to designing and inventing components and things like that. And even that, I think, has probably been stale for like 50 years. Sam Bucknan makes this point. You know, there's no component in your cell phone that wasn't around 50 years ago. It's just miniaturized because of manufacturing processes or something like that. And people really even misappropriate the fruits of science to a large degree, because they think that just because someone has done more engineering and invented a better manufacturing process, that somehow that's attributable to science. It's not really. That's almost a completely different sort of field that is not scientific. It's really much more ingenuity. It's more intuitive than it had anything to do with the knowledge of science in some sense. Um, I do believe it's slightly weird to call engineering a science. Um, and in the end of the day, that's what science seeks to do. It seeks to create fields of, in some sense, bunk knowledge that is so well bounded that then you can do engineering with it, like like in some sense, the chemical level of operation is, we know, it's essentially, it's an approximate fiction. You can kind of derive chemical, stable kind of chemical descriptions of reality from looking at some kind of subatomic um, properties and things like that. But those subatomic properties aren't useful for engineering. But in some sense, the subatomic is much closer to what's actually really going on in reality. So what is chemistry is just another kind of culinary art. I mean, literally, what's the difference? You know, it's a different degree of technical specificity, perhaps, and a different, let's say, list of ingredients, the periodic table, and it has, like some kind of contextual, um, mechanical, I mean, they've all been reduced into, in some sense, extroverted thinking models, and then they get passed off and fraudulently passed off as kind of TI self-consistency, as if there's any truth in that field. In fact, there isn't. It's the same thing as like when you're in calculus and you're using the triple equal sign. That's not a true equivalency. Um, that's like that's a fictitious definition in some sense. It's and the functionality of that is somewhat incredibly dubious. It's not justified in reason. It has its own logic and rationality attached to it, but I mean, in some sense, it's highly dubious. It's not true in any close sense of the word of true. It's something like approximately true, and it's good enough to use to depend on your models if you want to depend on models. And then where does morality go? It goes out the window when you make yourself subject to these models, because they are useful in the field of predictability, so that we don't have to use our reason to independently substantiate and justify what it is that we're doing. So now we're acting beyond justification. We're also acting beyond the field of law, where law can even peer, because we are just sort of, we are being the human experimentated on by these people with white lab coats. Uh, anyway, that's kind of like one of the versions of it, but I can specifically go into, for example, the theory of evolution and why it's utterly trash from a theoretical perspective. It might be scientifically useful. I mean, it's been described many times as one of the most scientifically valid theories, or something like that. I mean, which is really saying quite a lot about the whole field of science when you say, well, it's one of the most successful scientific theories. I mean, what makes it successful? That it produces some kind of utilitarian entrenchment of the field into what is essentially a kind of, it's a useful fiction. When you describe the whole world as being either comprised of selective pressures or random mutations, you've got a total description, but it's not an explanation. And in some sense, you could never even falsify the explanation. Or if you want to try to falsify it as an explanation, it's not even possible. So in some sense, it's really unfalsifiable. In that sense, it's bad science, in some sense. But it's a close enough approximate that whatever is happening in evolution can roughly fall underneath that generalization, that reductionism, which is based on a total description of the world. Like, yes, if you give yourself the ability to put everything into one of two camps, either a selective pressure or a random mutation, then you can make a plausibly viable, a possibly valid mechanical description. So in the sense that it's a successful scientific theory, because it helps you describe the world in terms in which science is used to seeing things modeled. But I mean, that's like that's a tautological sort of self-referencing problem there. I mean, how is it substantiated as an explanation? It's not. It's thumbsucked. It's pathetic. I mean, and you can't say that Darwin was the problem here. Newton was the problem here because Darwin even said quite clearly, well, it's just a theory. Anyway, Newton really screwed up the whole field with his mathematical modeling of things, which are also essentially just descriptions, not explanations. And people knew that he was essentially corrupting even the scientific language, because then after Newton, people started really not knowing what the hell they were even talking about. Reason had completely gone out the window, intuition had completely gone out the window, because now it wasn't the case about this is a regularity, this is a magnitude, because my measurement device tells me that this is the magnitude of the measurement of this phenomena, and this phenomena is very regular, so it's a regularity. Then what becomes in vogue is it's a law of nature. It's a law of nature, not it's a regularity. The humble language goes out the window. Look, obviously before Newton there were people that also bandied about law of nature, but the more clever ones, Bacon and such, they were very precise about these things. It's a regularity, it's a magnitude. After Newton, it's no longer a magnitude, it's a quantity. This thumb-sucked objectivism pulled out of where? Pulled out of their own arses, of their own Ponzi scheme, because Newton says, well, if we just keep on modeling it, then we'll get all the pieces of the puzzle, and then we'll be proven at the end of the story in the future. It's a Ponzi scheme. That's what science is. It's a philosophical Ponzi scheme. It's like the what is it? The sunk cost fallacy to a large extent. Anyway, moving on. So talking about medicine, now you can, when you actually talk about things that actually really matter, you can start to see the principles of what I just said in practice. What is the problem with medicine? Medicine does have lots of problems. I mean, there are fields of knowledge that we still need to go into because, in some sense, we discovered all the chemical processes in the human anatomy. We know chemically every catalytic process, biological, chemical, whatever it's called. We know all of them. We've known them actually for quite some time now. And that's not good enough because it's complicated. Because, in some sense, what's going on is very dynamic. So you can't, it doesn't help you because what is controlling what's going on is, in some sense, you can find a million different things that will cascade into causing the same process. So the only way to make sense of it is if you actually almost arbitrarily find correlations between certain processes, and that those correlations are only useful as subtractions. I don't know if I've made up that word, but I think that's a very useful word, a subtraction, in connection with other subtractions that then in some, because I mean, when they teach medicine, they teach you how everything works as a system, as kind of systemic dependencies and things like that. But you actually don't want to know it that holistically if you actually want to do interventionist medicine in some sense, because if you understand it as a system, you can understand breakdowns and you can understand, simply in a very simple way how to fix a breakdown, a very sort of overt breakdown, and you can maybe work out how to jumpstart something that's very simple if you can hopefully rely on homeostasis to kind of get you going after that. But if the problem is not homeostasis, maybe the problem itself is that your homeostasis is under a miasma, is fundamentally chronically pathological in some sense because you've got an imbalance within the chemicals or whatever, then you don't know what the hell you're doing with medicine. Then all your general rules of medicine, which don't understand, let's say, the differences in personal medicine, because we don't understand how psychology. I do think that to really have a proper medicine, you need it sort of framed more in alchemy than in science, because then you'll understand that. And I think the top people in the field kind of already know that it's a form of alchemy in some sense, because you know that essentially you don't want to know how things work in terms of how they break down as a system or how they have cascading failures. In some sense, that's the background noise. You need to know how they positively function to get something done, but you also need to try to work out the different ways in which that can be subtracted. That, how many ways you can skin a cat, sort of thing. And so what you want to know is how a component of one system impinges and works with a component of another system in connection with a component of another system. So you've kind of got a subtracted subsystem. And then you have to have enough subtractions of enough subsystems and work out how they correlate and interrelate and crisscross. And then that's how you would ever do interventionist medicine, is you would work out, well, actually the reason why everything is out of whack is actually because this is the prime symptom or something like that. And even if you know the prime symptom, you can't even necessarily fix it because it's actually too complicated, because you can't fix it directly. You need to actually find a better way to fix it indirectly from multiple prongs almost simultaneously, or as a kind of, and sort of homeopathy has always kind of had this idea to it, although homeopathy, I shouldn't talk too much about things that I'm not that accustomed to understanding. Um, but I mean, and this is complete conjecture, and this needs to be taken with a huge grain of salt. Um, because I was just thinking, I wonder if Germany, the politics of Germany, is something like the heroic medicine of homeopathy, that the leaders are sort of trying to perform homeopathy on their society, and that is actually, anyway, sorry, that's a complete sort of strange tangent there, but I mean that plugs into all my political critique when I'm talking about the problem with Germany and the problem with France as two sides of the same coin of the Napoleonic corruption, as I call it. Um, and by the way, I mean I've criticized all these countries, and I almost said nice things about Britain, but I mean Britain also does cast a shadow on its own society, because a lot of its let's say classical liberal philosophy is so based in its tradition, its culture, and its history that it's not manifest. And this came through when I was talking about the problem with America, um, and perhaps its premature revolution against King George, but also that essentially that because of that history, both countries kind of got a leg up into the future, into progress, into, but in some sense they kind of, because of the War of Independence, that history did not have to be brokered, let's say, through hard structures of law, and in some sense through a hard constitution. I mean, America got a constitution, and I would say it kind of got a half-baked constitution, at least when it comes to uh, the establishment of federal rights or constitutional rights, is the biggest flaw in the American system, because their constitutional rights are just proper. I don't want to repeat all of this stuff, but essentially it's just political rhetoric. They're not really justiciable rights. They're kind of worthless on those grounds, but they have a cultural value to them. So in some sense, that's almost like what Britain never did. Britain never fully cashed out its rights because it knew that they were weak, and in some sense Britain had, in some sense, the kind of the humility to not create useless political rhetoric and call it the frame of law or something like that, because then you're using law as a kind of, as a cultural linchpin. In America, at least Britain doesn't do that. So Britain didn't dirty its own law, but it also still has this sort of gaping lacuna in the cultural consciousness, because not everyone wants to relate to their society as a historical tradition. They want to know what the deal is, let's say, on the face of it. They want to see it in the letter of the law, and they want it justifiable, and they want, and that is a tall order, So I would say that that is what's missing in Britain, to some degree, and it does have a horrible influence on a lot of its people, because a lot of its people can't know how deep the rabbit hole is, because it's somewhat ensconced in the historical development, which is a very ephemeral thing, which other politics can't really imbibe properly. You can't really, except in my country. I think my legal tradition has actually perfected all of these things, uh, almost by historical luck. Uh, I mean, a lot of that was also because of the British, because when the British took over, they didn't replace the Roman Dutch substantive law because they recognized that it was better than their substantive law. And they added still the common law to it, which made it even better, I would say. So we have a very interesting mixed system that is kind of like the synthesis of Rome and Christian ethics. And in some sense, I think that the alchemy of the synthesis of those two ingredients actually means that you can actually have the rule of law, which I don't really think exists in many other countries. In some sense, you could make an argument that it does exist in Britain. But the problem is that I would say that the system is not explicit enough for all of its citizens, for all of the, it's good enough maybe for the lawyers that are educated in it. But, I do think that you need to do what America somewhat does, is you need to be able to, well, they don't do it anymore, but you need to be able to teach civics to children, and you need to be able to induct them into the hard power and to respect and value the hard power structures because they are justifiable, they are moral, they are reasonable. You can do that in my country, although I think my country is the only country that you could do that in, that we have all the perfect structure, but we just have very corrupt politics, and we have even that corrupt politics has corrupted the jurisprudence. So the legal tradition, I think, is gold, but the legal jurisprudence at the moment has somewhat even betrayed the Constitution. They have completely reinterpreted constitutional values to go in line with the identity politics racialist bullshit, which is very explicitly anti the South African Constitution. So these people are, I would call them war criminals in the waiting. They're somewhat trying to get us towards, sort of, I think it's almost like the replay of Weimar Germany. Anyways, all these interesting political, geopolitical, ideological parallels. I like to see it from the ideological perspective more so than anything else. Um, and it will be a terrible thing if the treasure that was developed in this country of the democratic revolution of 1993-94 is essentially lost because of black racists that betrayed their own morality and their ethics and their values because of political corruption, because of expedient kleptocracy and plutocracy, because of the winds of change and the winds of toxic, noxious proto-fascism that came to our shores from America as their legal scholars poisoned our legal tradition to be in line with their disgusting and decrepit constitutional crisis, which belongs to them. America does deserve to have a constitutional crisis because their legal tradition is shit. But never mind. All these parallels here. Sorry, I just wanted to make that point about the homeopathy in Germany, but that's quite an interesting sort of cross-cultural sort of perspective. So yeah, anyway, it's interesting that we can know all the chemistry in the body, and we still don't know how to fix. We even don't know what causes a lot of medical conditions, because a lot of those medical conditions and illnesses are in some sense, let's say, I can't think of all the nice words maybe, but it's something like some kind of intransigence within the homeostasis of a miscalibration between certain subtracted systems, and a lot of those subtractions are themselves arbitrary, perhaps. So you could redefine it. You could define it as a complex of many different groupings of subtraction, which some of those subtractions might be mutually exclusive, and some of them might have intermediaries in which that sub groupings of subtractions which, let's say, are bounded and non-mix and not capable of being mixed by other ones can perhaps be mixed with other ones with certain intermediary steps of specialization and exception, which perhaps even become more possible when you actually have like a kind of intransigence within the homeostasis. So what I'm trying to describe is that like alchemy is actually a real concern of the pragmatism of epistemology of things. And in some sense, it kind of is the unification of ontology and epistemology in a synthesis. I mean, so I do think that that's often how I describe my understanding of psychology, is that there is a huge interplay between epistemology and ontology in the psychological realm. And to actually understand psychology, you have to understand, in some sense, the gendered and complicated dynamism between the interrelation between those two things, because at some point in time there was a crossing of the wires, and then afterwards there was a different kind of epoch in the psychology, and it's not all one thing. And without that kind of very complicated sort of ability to place things into a subtraction, in the alchemical process, this might be, I can't remember all the terminology in alchemy, but negatio, that you have to kind of let yourself be confused. Um, you have to let yourself not know so that you can sort of quest for it. That there's a journey involved. That you are not. This is a biblical term. So to sojourn. Rather than this line of progress, and where does it point? Where does it lead? There's no sort of encircled. Uh, there's no full circle, as it were. That's capable with the line. You kind of already have to start from a position of, in some sense, a completeness in your intuition, a completeness in your faith, a oneness in your faith. Otherwise, in some sense, you're just going to reify or manifest or come to another expression that reflects your own fractured faith. Anyway, the problem of being in pursuit of something. I've actually forgotten this little ramble about pursuit, but there's a fundamental sort of problem if that you're in pursuit of something. Do you aim to be in pursuit of something, or do you aim to be? If you can't see the finish line, if you can't conceive of the are you in pursuit of? In some sense, you can't be in pursuit of something on a kind of conceptual sort of level. Like technically the answer has to be sort of already in you but hiding. You have to recollect something, not pursue it. But I mean, I don't want to be too. In some sense, what really pursuit is, if you want to kind of clean it up and do it properly, is that it is a kind of resonance of your own fiber. It is a recognition of the fiber that you have, which means that you are compatible. You have a kind of self-knowledge as to how you might coordinate with others as being part of the ingredient of uh, 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 precipitation. That so that you're doing the alchemy of precipitating an answer, but you're not in pursuit of the answer because you already know the process of precipitation, or at least you know your part in the process, and you're looking for the other collaborators. So you already have something of the process in mind, uh, and that is perhaps the difference between a pursuit and a sojourn. Um, And in some sense, that doesn't mean that you can't change your tentative, coordinated sort of envisioned collaboration. It doesn't mean that you can't sort of make substitutions, but you have to be very careful when you make substitutions with, let's say, with a process that that you've kind of already envisioned, because then in some sense are you not interrupting your sojourn with a new, well, is it a substitution, or have you left the other pursuit behind? Have you left it as a pursuit, as an unfinished pursuit? Anyway, I mean, these are things that I think can trouble people, because they can sort of give them idea that, well, they have a kind of, in their fiber, that they have a kind of philandering philosophy, and that can kind of be sort of antithetical to having a sense of your own fiber, a sense of, in retrospect, when you think about yourself, how tough are you then? If you are, I mean, so you have to kind of, I mean, I'm not saying that you can't do this, I'm just saying that, I'm just showing a potential break with oneself, that, if one is a bit too bent by expedience and convenience, to the extent to which that, in some, I mean, this is a form of the whole pursuit sort of issue, and what I'm talking about is a form of extroverted intuition. So in some sense, you have to know the limit of your own fiber to some degree, to give you the ambit of your uh, realm of operation. Anyway, I just kind of taught myself something, because that fifth dimension of psychological reality, extroverted intuition, is something that I have to work on, perhaps, or I need to focus on acclimatizing myself toward. Anyway, so I'm giving therapy to myself while I'm making these weird esoteric recordings. What else? It's probably good that I am documenting this to some degree, because in some sense it is an example of someone who has, well, within my own self-actualization sort of rundown, or my own self-actualization sort of procedure, which is kind of connected to my theory. I have someone that has crucified their ego, opened the gate to the superego, uh, had a bit of aberrant salience while I was trying to work out how I should be treating the nebulous aspects of the superego, and trying to kind of work out how to install what where. And I've kind of got the idea that the sin of the ego is also the death of the superego. I still, and then the child function of the superego, which was nebulous, maybe that becomes an annexation of the ego. So that becomes sort of more part of the ego than part of the superego, as a kind of, as a thing that is adjoined to the crucifixion, and it makes the crucifixion easier and stable. And then the dominant function, which is in some sense would have been the vanity of the superego, which was before completely nebulous, then is kind of where you have to, that's where you have to reform things, because you have to actually stabilize that function. And that, I think, is something like the New Jerusalem. And that will stabilize that will stabilize the false prophet and will, in some sense, then the false prophet won't exist anymore, and you'll kind of reclaim that dimension for the tree of life. In some sense, it'll stop being the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, and it'll go back to the tree of life. So I think that that is how archetypally it kind of all fits together. I was just trying to, yeah. So I mean, I've been sort of been working through that recipe, and it's interesting because I think the child that gets stolen away by the dragon is somewhat connected to the child function in the superego that gets stolen away by the woman on the dragon, uh, to be born or something like that. Is something like the halo that in some sense that is the annexation of the child function in the superego by the ego. So the ego gets to stabilize itself because of the halo, the child, uh, that is stolen away from the superego for making the crucifixion more, uh, in some sense, naturalized. And between the naturalization and harmonization, essentially between the crucified ego and the superego, is that the subconscious loses its toxicity. And then you can kind of enjoy the golden circuitry of the unconscious, because then the metagram circuitry in the unconscious gets kind of, yeah. So anyway, I guess that's my recipe for self-actualization. Um, Obviously, I also need to eventually do more research on people's stumbling blocks in terms of metagram circuitry in what I've already referred to as the narcissistic gateway between the subconscious and the unconscious, the gateway filter, which in some sense has to be sealed at some point so that the unconscious and the ego can properly develop. And that, I believe, is what is referred to in scripture when it talks about that, when it talks about the three-headed beast, that one of the heads of the three-headed beast is badly bruised and maimed, essentially. And I think that you need to kind of cut off the subconscious and kind of extract the goodness that's in the subconscious and replicate it in the unconscious, so that the unconscious can come to a final resolution between what I call the borderline gateway, which is the gateway between the unconscious and the ego, the gateway filter. And that is like the problem of Keegan stage 4.5, or I also call it Keegan stage 3.5. I think, well, in some sense, what I call Keegan stage 3.5 is somewhat similar to the concept of Keegan stage 4.5, but I think 4.5s actually occur because there's a bit of narcissism and there's a bit of borderline mixed together, and then they kind of project you a stable use of four. So you kind of, some sense, people that are in Keegan stage 4 and that are 4.5 are kind of, they are only stabilized by a kind of unconscious codependency. So they need to have a culture, they need to have an organization, and only within the context of that organization are they in Keegan stage 4, but it's kind of like, it's tacitly nihilistic as well. So I do think that in some sense I've got probably a more sophisticated idea of what Keegan stage 4.5 is, but I must keep on saying that I only know about Keegan's work indirectly and I haven't read his book. Um, Sort of a developmental psychologist. Anyway, what else should I say? Anyway, now I'm just kind of talking off the cuff. Let me just stop this. But yeah, I mean, I do feel I do need to do more work on my theory because it's kind of to make a book about it. I could still make a book about it, but it's going to seem weird that like I don't know anything about the other types. Like I know about them, I know the description of them, but like I haven't sort of gone through and verified every single other type, the 48 metagram circuits and the 17 metatype circuits. Like I mean, I find other types all the time, and I can accurately type them, I believe, and describe what's going on in their head and how they think. But that's not all the types, and in some sense, I do think that there is also a lot of things that can be said because there are types of drama, melodrama, there are types of issues that certain metatypes are just prone to creating or being entrenched in. And in some sense, I have my own particular metatype and metagram as a baseline of that. Although, in some sense, I think that maybe the particular fall of that personality, the particular seed of the false ego complex in someone, I wonder if it could be called like an impingement of the environment or a trauma or something like that. Because in some sense, it's both. Something happens, but you also react to it. But you also need to react to something because it's very hard to be born into a world. I don't think. I think you need a metatype. You, at the very least, I think you do need a metatype. You can maybe avoid developing a metagram, maybe. Most people, I think, can't do that. I mean, I think I did avoid developing a metagram myself. And in some sense, I was only tentatively exploring the possibility of developing a metagram from the age of 4. And I was able to kind of suspend the development of it. But then I decided not to suspend it because I wanted to research the false ego complex and I wanted to use myself as a bit of a kind of as a lightning rod, as a conductor, to so that I could measure it inside myself as well, so I could see it from the inside out. And in some sense, I wouldn't have been able, I think, to monitor the karmic field circuits, or at least the circuitry that people receive and send, that their metagram circuitry is being impinged on by other people's metagram circuitry. And there's, in some sense, there's also that is represented in the material world as well, because like a piece of art is representing to you someone else's motivation, somebody else's question or outreach or influence of their thinking. And in some sense, that is, I mean, I haven't fully formalized all my beliefs and understanding around field circuits, because field circuits, in some sense, I don't think necessarily bear a striking. Like, it could be that some people can make a mountain out of a molehill. Like, some person doesn't even make art. There's just a piece of nature that exists, and somebody walks past it and they look at the piece of nature and they say, this means that God told me this. And then they take that forward, and it's like, it's actually just a manifestation of an earlier incident in their life, of an interaction with somebody else, or their own decision making process that developed their own character in a very sort of ill fitting way. And then they're just seeing, they just projected it onto that piece of nature. So in some sense, they can then create a mountain out of a molehill, but they didn't. It wasn't nature that did it, but the nature was part of it. So there's this weird thing that it's not a strict mechanical action. It's not a strict sort of, you can't sort of aggregate the system into zero energy. It doesn't work like that. It, in some sense, it all functions parasitically on the basic individual self-determinism that is hosting all of this false ego complex. And because there's more than one false ego complex, and because we might not perfectly empathize with other people's problems, and because of the gap in knowledge, the problem of knowledge itself, that how much control can we have when how much knowledge we have about our own psychology and about other people's psychology leads to a lot of irresponsibility that's even tacitly creating a form of nebulousness in which you can kind of, you've got all this fissile material in the petri dish that can be weaponized and militarized by the person to get to it first, perhaps, or the person to get to it second, after somebody else has kind of processed it, and then you've kind of got this amalgamation of drama upon melodrama upon novated ingenuity, and then a new breakdown, and then a new drama. It's kind of, and then that leads to a kind of very toxic form of mysticism. In what I mean, I do think that the biggest evils in metaphysics and religion and spiritual philosophy come in these varieties: pantheism, perennialism, uh, solipsism, roughly speaking. And in some sense, you can all reduce those down to idolatries. But the problem of vanity is a hard problem, which I think I've created a decent enough theodicy about it in one of my recent recordings. But anyway, anyway, I can't remember how I ended the last recording, but I feel like I must add this caveat because it's such a sort of a pitfall that when I say that you have a golden circuit in your metagram circuitry instead at the end of the sort of process of self-actualization, you don't objectively have a golden circuit because there is no objective reality or truth in field circuits. You only have a golden circuit in some sense in relation to your own ego, and in some sense in the way in which that you can perhaps also have a shared culture, a Keegan stage 4 culture that is with other people, that is a shared faith or something like that, that has kind of the same attunement, the same condition, the same mental. So in some sense, you have a single faith instantiated in many different individuals and many different metatypes, in some sense, and there's a kind of harmony in that, perhaps, and all those sorts of things. But see, the reason why I'm a little bit reticent when I talk about these things, because I still have to be slightly vague, because I don't actually know enough broadly about other types. Like, I wonder, can every type crucify itself? Or are some types, because of their metatype tone arm, are they fundamentally, that they can still belong to a righteous culture with a righteous hard structure that can sort of regulate some, and if you have the right psychological knowledge within a society, and you have the right legal structure within a society and legal theory, that you can kind of set up a system in which people can somewhat attune themselves to that. But I mean, I haven't fully gone into looking at all the different metatypes. Of some types are almost fundamentally goats, that they will never, that they can kind of align themselves in the direction. Well, in some sense, you could say that some of the types are kind of like, well, I mean, this is complete speculation, and I shouldn't almost be speculating like this because it might be frightening to people, and I don't really know the answers to these kinds of concerns or something like that. So I'm kind of just outwardly speculating. Is it perhaps that some types cannot really engage in a communion because of the style of their metatype, or because of the actual cognitive anatomy in their ego, that they in some sense are barred perhaps from uh, connecting to a single faith, but they can, in some sense, they might be able to still coexist with people that have a single faith, but they kind of have to have some kind of symbolic relational understanding of the law, because they don't have a faithful recollection of it themselves, because they can't share a faith, perhaps because they're just kind of uh, and this, I mean, that might be a completely sort of, I mean, in some sense, the free theta in the ego will always consist of a dominant function, a parent function, a trial, and a sin. And then I'm still expecting that any type would be able to crucify the ego and gain access to the superego and have that internal healing. But in some sense, the actual anatomy of those consecutive dimensions will mean that you'll have dominant function, a parent function, a trial and a sin, or an inferior. The trial is also called the inferior function, just using the metaphor of MBTI jargon. So that's four things. And then the child function of the superego is the fifth thing, because the sin of the ego is also the death of the superego, although the death was never actually created. When the superego emerges, it just emerges as a floating parent function. So the child function is a kind of is a fifth thing that the ego can essentially absorb, which is kind of like symbolically the halo above the head, I believe. And then the next thing as well is the dominant function of the superego, which also never emerged until the ego is right there and then, knowing that it needs to essentially keep the child function unstructured, but then attempt to structure the dominant function and the superego. So it has to be very careful not to create a kind of a structure where the child function of the superego is, and it has to try to create a grounded structure where the dominant function and the superego is, and that kind of somehow both of those things together. In some sense, I think keeping the child function empty is something like, to mix a metaphor, is both the halo but also like the lake of fire that encircles the parent function, the floating parent function, and it binds the floating parent function within the halo, to mix that symbol on top of what is described in Revelations. And so the annexation of the ego of the superego's child function is constructively the lake of fire. And then the precipitation of that is something like the New Jerusalem, which is founded in the dominant function. And then essentially the false prophet essentially reverts back to the tree of life and it stops offering the knowledge, the fruit of the knowledge of good and evil in a symbolic constructive sense, in the way that the false prophet is kind of the contract of the false prophet from the superego to the subconscious is something like the remembrance of the gorging, or the partaking of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, or the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. So in some sense, the kind of the death and the lust, or the death and the child function in the subconscious, is something like combined, both of those together, or something like the fruit of the knowledge of good and evil, which is in some sense the superego's inferior function and the superego's sin, but in some sense they're not the superego's trial or inferior function and sin, because it doesn't have a trial and a sin, because it doesn't have a child function to live up to. So because the superego has no child function, it cannot sin. So it's free to just keep on making promises. It's free to keep on duping the subconscious, and the subconscious has these free beliefs that come out of nothing, but then they're fundamentally toxic, but there's no way to understand that toxicity other than in the subconscious eventually getting sick of itself and creating the unconscious, creating emotional circuitry. Because the beliefs themselves are just like poisonous narcissism in some sense, because you cannot extract an endless amount of good from beliefs, because beliefs all have their limits. They all have their contextual or not redundancy, but despondency and sort of fatal sort of even self-denigration. Beliefs don't conserve themselves because they're not the same as life in that way. So it's something like belief plus context, which is something like the promise of the unconscious, or what emerges out of the unconscious in the unresolved, because in some sense the unconscious still wants to kind of redeem the partial compartmentalized loss that the subconscious is acceding to when it agrees to essentially create the unconscious side of the mind, because it doesn't like its own sin, and the subconscious doesn't like its own sin, and it doesn't want to continue to deal with its own inferior function, which keeps on precipitating the sin of the subconscious, because the beliefs are all defective, essentially. So it tries to jettison that defective nature to hopefully be to be specialized and maybe returned to at some point. But in some sense, you cannot go backwards down through the false ego complex. You have to go forwards. You have to go up from the ego into the super ego, then to fix the root of the problem of the subconscious, instead of trying to tend to the subconscious directly. Because you cannot fix the problem with beliefs without attending to the super ego, essentially. And the problem with the superego is that it's this floating parent function, so it doesn't have enough context to bind itself up. So the ego actually has to put its hand in there and kind of annex part of it and fix part of it and structure part of it. And then in some sense, the tree of life, or the false prophet, which then reverts back to the tree of life, is justifiably the medium through which that you see life and the world through, because you have to live in the world. You have to live in the world so that you can always overcome the world, that you can transcend the flesh, is a continual first seek the kingdom, that commandment never ends, that the seeking never ends, the everlasting life. It's a eternal endeavor. And it comes not with observation. It comes with, that is what you are in fact in the pursuit of. You're in the pursuit of the kingdom always, in that sense. But at least then with the tree of life, you are in the thick of it. You are in the midst of it again, in the midst of the Holy Ghost proper. I do think somewhat the tree of life is the tree of the Holy Ghost. And the tree of the fruit of the knowledge of good and evil is also the tree of the Holy Ghost, but it's known in the forbidden way. And so in some sense, you've been adopted by something else. You've been adopted by the spirit of man. And you've given up your contentment and joy and peace in the Holy Ghost. But anyway, and then returning to it is more difficult. Returning to it is not possible without actually having a justification of how you can return to it, which is then also gives you, in some sense, how to navigate life with knowledge, but not with the knowledge of good and evil in some sense, with the knowledge of the truth, or knowledge about the truth in some sense. And, something like Noam Chomsky's title of that lecture, The Limits of Reason, The Ghost in the Machine, or was it the Limits of Reason and Understanding, The Ghost in the Machine. I mean, some of that title is a bit, maybe, I think it was The Limits of Reason and Human Understanding and The Ghost in the Machine. Pretty good lecture. It echoes the thing that I always talk about complaining about Newton, how he messed up sort of intellectualism with this kind of rational fetish and obsession. So anyway, this is a long way of saying that the circuit itself is not gold in an objective way, because there's no such thing as objective good and evil. You can subjectively say that it is true that I have a golden circuit, but that is something that you can't sort of objectively claim or try to create an objective convention around, because then you're going to have a very toxic tacit belief structure. So there is this kind of tentative humility which you can't get around, that you always, any belief claim that you sort of stand on will always be, well, I might be wrong. And because in some sense, you can be made wrong just by having the context pulled out from under your feet. So in some sense, being made wrong in terms of your belief system is just a trick of sophistry, is just a kind of a decontextualization or recontextualization. Um, and sometimes mistakes will invariably happen, because sometimes, because not everyone can be expected to do the requisite amount of homework before they start participating, because they kind of, I mean, this is also or somewhat the point of time and place, and propriety and etiquette and decorum can be used as ways to insulate from untoward, let's say, negative interference in something like that, which is why, anyway, so there are very sort of practical challenges to be met at some point, and we can't just sort of all be bestowed with some kind of special high status which is undeserved or unearned or unwarranted. Uh, just because, in some sense, the label of it is wanted. It's like, these are people. I mean, the problem, in some sense, that I keep on going on about, the problem with the peasants are revolting, the peasants are revolting, or this is somewhat made more clear if you say, I don't understand, or if you say, if you're telling me about a revolution to a foreigner, and I'm a foreigner and I don't know the history of your country, and then you say some things, and I ask the clarification question, well, are the peasants revolting? And are the peasants revolting? Or is it both? Like, I'm asking two separate things there. And the ambiguity in that is really the problem of the human condition in a nutshell as well. But it's not wrong and it's not right. In the joint proposition that, if you kind of conflate the two uh, into a single state of affairs, taking stock of these things is. So I was just trying to say that, I was trying to get to the point of saying that to know the label of something that you want to experience or say that you've experienced or have the same status as experiencing it, is like willing the end but not willing the means to the end. It's there is a darkness there. There is a fear, at least there, at the very least. Some kind of fear, but some kind of, and I guess just riffing off of something else that I was listening to recently, how fear itself has become a kind of, has become manifested in people
as a kind of as a phobos, or sorry, as an actual sort of everything has everything that should be in the discerning, we kind of have manifested to us in a kind of in a social narrative, which is in some sense very, very poisonous. Because I mean that only happens when people are so plugged out of their own being that they are so blinded by their own bullshit, by their own, that they say that they want something, but they don't. They will the ends, but they don't will the means to the ends. They don't care about doing it the right way. They just know that they want it, and then they say that they deserve it, and then because there's so much of the sympathy which has crowded out any form of reason and thought, it's really, it is very scary. I mean, the level of false consciousness, the level of false religion, the level of although I would say that it's not universal across the board. I would say that there's much more of this on the left than there is on the right. And I know people will say that that's controversial. I actually think that that kind of claim is almost uncontroversial. The only mythologically messed up people on the right are very few and far between. Kooky people, maybe, the overt fascists, of which there are very few, in fact. But in some sense, it's very easy almost to even to cut through their bullshit and to dispel them, because it's very easy to say, you see, you're just like the left-wing lunatics. You just plug yourself into the narrative because you're too weak to face reality. You're too weak to do the reason yourself. And what's ironic is that the people on the left have just been listening to this very cookie cutter, very pre-programmed, very sort of narrated, scripted, sort of, in some sense, the thing, how the left gets away with it, though, is that they've got all these brittle intellectual tricks and witchcraft, in some sense, that kind of gates their narrative from having to face the fact that it's unjustifiable bullshit. And the thing that really gates that tremendously is the idea of objective reality, because objective reality is such an intellectually feeble kind of construct that you can easily kind of just set up a few rational sounding, logical sounding, little tidbits that kind of accomplish a kind of gatekeeping of decontextualization, that you can always decontextualize the enemy and leverage everything while we're just reacting to the enemy because the enemy is so evil, the enemy is so racist, and it's just it's utter. I mean, the level of self delusion and the level of misleading people with essentially a narrative just because it's repeated. Like literally, it has no basis in reality. It's the reality is created merely by repetition. I mean, it's utterly insane. Just the supposed educated on people on the so-called left, how plugged in they are to essentially the signal, the fake signals of just repetitive virtue signaling and repetitive storytelling. It's scary. I mean, it's a testament to sort of 1984. Um, Whereas the people on the right, at least if they are misled, they are doing so in a context that's far more genuine and authentic and fair and honest. And if you actually incultured yourself to their beliefs and then tried to argue with them one on one, you would at least get something more like a an exchange that wasn't gate kept by very lowbrow, abject, well, that's just not objective, man. Like that's just your objectivity, man. Or you're trying to be objective, but you're not trying as well as we have succeeded in our collective hive mind of CNN and MSNBC, who tells us that yeah, Trump really is a racist because he never apologized for saying that there were good people on both sides, because we didn't bother to play the whole clip where he very explicitly said that I'm not referring to the fascists, and he basically denounced the fascists and the racist. He literally said, I'm not talking about the racists and the fascists. I denounce them in the original quotation, which has been decontextualized, and I mean, that was even brought up in the in the presidential debate. And this passes as objective journalism from the left. It's and then you get this horrible kind of excuse making. Well, it's just as bad as Fox News. Actually, no, I don't think so. I think Fox News has an enlightened subjectivity to it, and it's very honest about that. And some anchors and some presenters are more fair than others. And sometimes I hear people saying things on Fox News, and I think, I don't like that argument. But maybe he liked that argument, and he didn't hear a counter argument to it. And so I have my opinion, and he has his opinion. Fox News is much more personable because it's opinion journalism, and it doesn't try to say that it's objective, but in some sense it tries to be honest, and it claims to be fair, which is why you actually have real in-depth exchange on Fox News, where they will actually have people that will put the alternative ideological point as part of the debate. Tucker Carlson will have a long form interview with someone in which Tucker Carlson will even be asked counter argument questions. I mean, are people, you're not allowed to ask questions of the interviewer on CNN. You don't ask the journalist the questions because they're not biased. I mean, you have to be brain dead to fall for this kind of magic show. I mean, this is a magic show. I mean, this is blatant propaganda. I mean, CNN is 1984 style propaganda. Fox News is not, in fact. Fox News actually is above board. So the right has been getting this right on moral issue after moral issue for so long, but the left is so toxic and radically dishonest, and in leveraging of experts and framing and decontextualizing, that in some sense it even encourages Fox News to almost be a little bit more radical when they are trying to report on these things, because they're kind of they the left says, oh, you see, they're just making a mountain out of a molehill. They keep on whining about symbolic things, because you have different values, but on the left, no one is defending the values on the left because they're bankrupt in terms of values, because they just assume that they are morally superior, and because they don't actually have opinion-based newscasting. I mean, the MSNBC, I guess, will never actually have someone like Tucker Carlson that actually has an argument with someone, a long-form argument with someone on ideological grounds. They will do hit jobs. They will, you'll have maybe one person in a panel or two people in a panel where they're outnumbered, where they can kind of be shouted over, and then it's always some kind of, oh, you see, you're arguing from different facts because our experts are better, or something like that. They don't even get into the value exchange or the value substantiation. It's completely devoid of reason. It's just this kind of faux self-consistency saying, look, we are logical, therefore we are correct. It's this TI cultism, introverted thinking cultism, anyway. Now, it might be the case that some individuals, I haven't looked at all the metatypes and understood this, but it might be that some individuals maybe can never be individuals in this sense. They have to be part of a group. They have to be part of a collective, perhaps. Maybe some metatypes are thus. And they will always be goats in this way. I wonder if it's not a psychological thing, but I mean, it is scary because, well, I do see it much more prevalently on the left, as it historically always generally is. This kind of this cultish world religion that destroys everything in its wake, chews up humanity, because it's so easy to kind of shadow puppet from a kind of plutocratic elite as well. Anyway. Not to be crude, but just to integrate what I have said in these recordings with what I've said in other recent recordings, is essentially to do something of this, that in some sense to seal the gateway, the narcissistic gateway between the subconscious and the unconscious. That can be sealed, I think, for every type, and that must be sealed on the way towards the crucifixion of the ego, in the ego. But the borderline gateway between the unconscious and the ego, I mean, de facto, it will be true as well that in the world there will be people that are working through that developmental gateway, and they need a culture that's safe enough, or let's just say that has some guardrails in it. And I think that the only way to have those guardrails properly in place is if you have enough accumulated knowledge, either about the law and also about psychology, and you have those hard and soft structures sort of guiding the relative, sort of are the kind of guardrails in society. That the law is obviously the hard power, and psychology as a subject is kind of like soft power, but between those two poles you can also deviate from the psychology. Like, you're not expected to live up to the psychology, but in some sense, when you have psychologists giving expert testimony in court cases, then at least we're not going to have false authorities that mislead us and have us misjudge human beings. So those two things are very important, I think. But in some sense, what I'm saying when I talk about the goats, or maybe there are some metatypes that are fundamentally not capable of sort of having a shared faith, in some sense that would mean that they would always have in some way, an unregulated filter. They would have. I mean, look, I'm speculating here. I don't know what I'm talking about, so I don't know if there are metatypes that would accord to this. But it might just so happen to be that in the ego there are the functions which are literally the cognitive functions that your mind is immediately thinking through, that your actual conscious mind has only the latitude of the functions that correspond in the ego, which are unbridled by unconsciousness. And, like, roughly speaking, I believe that is only the dominant function in the ego, the parent function, and the inferior function, and the sin. And in some sense, people don't like their own sin of their ego because it's the terminal sin of the whole false ego complex, and usually then they are perversely incentivized to dig back their heels and entrench themselves back into the unconscious side of the mind, rather than having to try to take responsibility for essentially the terminal failure of the whole structure of the false ego complex. So the ego has within it a poison pill, but if you take the poison pill in the right mindset, with the keeping the death of Christ inside the body, taking on the sin of the world, taking that burden on, and specifically the crucifixion has more to do with the trial function, and you're crucifying your parent function. It is the parent function that is the fleshly thinking in general. The apex of the false ego complex is that the fleshly thinking is the parent function, and the torture of that flesh is the inferior function. But if you resist the torture instead of taking it on acceptingly, because in some sense you know that the sin is bad, you know that the sin doesn't feel good, but if but if you take 100% responsibility for it, for the sin of the world, because in some sense you'll say, this is unfair, this is unfair. Look what's happening to Jesus Christ. He's being raised on a cross, and he was by mere accusation, and he was silent before his accusers. This is very important to understand the way to follow. That because the Christian scriptures are not talking about vicarious redemption. Jesus Christ does not die for you. Your mind is Jesus Christ, and it says in Corinthians, I die daily, and it talks about the death of Christ in the body. This is what it is: Christ consciousness, and your sin, which is an emergent property, which is a confluence of emergent events in some sense. And in some sense, it is unfair to the ego because the ego doesn't accept its own subconscious. The ego has already, it's like Neo in the Matrix. Neo knows that he was unplugged from the Matrix. He knows that he used to be a kind of a human battery. So he knows he doesn't like that. He knows that he doesn't like that it's a slave race or that it's a slave society and it's all built on hidden exploitation. He knows that. But does he say, I'm going to war with you, Mr. Machine? Because actually, there was already a war, and the humans lost that war because they didn't make peace originally. So who's at fault here? Are the machines really the bad guys? And does Neo really go to war with them? You see? So, you can't just kind of say, well, I put my tunnel vision on and I'm in the Matrix and I'm king of the Matrix because I can make the bullets stop and I can fly like Superman and I can do whatever I want inside the Matrix when I'm plugged in. But he's not that awesome outside of the Matrix, except if he can actually humble himself to go negotiate with the machines. So anyway, the point here is and I think things have been misinterpreted in the Matrix movies, but I mean these things are up for debate. When Neo seems to be controlling the machines in the real world, people think, well, that's because actually he's still in the Matrix, maybe. Or I like to think it's because maybe he's actually a special guy. Maybe the machine world, and he talks to a little kid on the train between the Matrix and the machine information substructure. Maybe they know about him adjacent. Maybe he's seen of angels, and so when they see his body outside the Matrix, when the hunter drone is coming to kill him, and he reaches out his hand, they're just somehow the physical embodied motion and in some sense the ephemeral, let's say, confidence of his he outstretches his hand. That's so irrational, that's so illogical. Usually hunter drones are attacking. I mean, have you ever, it's like animals are not sentient, but you can walk up to a lion, you can in fact steal food in front of a lion, and the lion, as long as you're a cool dude, the lion doesn't eat you. The lion, in some sense, because you didn't push the lion, you didn't try to hit the lion with some kind of stick or a branch or something like that. You know how the bushmen sometimes get meat when they're hungry. The lions look well fed. They've just had these kill. There's half a carcass on the ground. It's a fresh kill. They just walk up and they drag it off in front of them, literally in front of them. And cats will let you do that. What's going on there? I mean, do you look like a cat to them, maybe? Maybe it's like, lions live in prides. So how do they understand their internal community? How do they understand their togetherness and and the boundary of their in-group and their out-group? Obviously, the Bushmen figured out something about the pride of lions, that they can literally steal food in front of a lion in some sense, but obviously it doesn't look like that they're stealing food. Uh, because, I mean, a lion certainly wouldn't let a hyena come and take food. I mean, the hyena would have to do it when no one's looking or something like that. The lion would go and chase the hyena that was trying to steal food. But the Bushmen just literally in plain sight. Anyway, so I would say that is what's going on between Neo and the Hunter probes. It's not, oh, they're not still in the Matrix or something like that. That's what it. Or anyway, I mean, this is in some sense up to interpretation, but I mean, I'd like to say that I I literally wrote the script of the Matrix films. But anyway, that just makes me sound like a crackpot. But and I mean, and I put a lot of my alchemical psychological sort of research, and in some sense I was doing it intuitively quite a bit as well, into the writing, and I was even exploring a lot of interesting things at the time, seeing tentatively what some of the structures somewhat look like. It's interesting when I've been involved in filmmaking, it's always been this very sort of natural, fluid, intuitive thing, which is sometimes very strange then when you've got other writers and other people, other creatives who are not really intuitive, who are very sort of formulaic, and uh, anyway, quality of people nowadays is slightly scares me about how depraved the culture has gotten, how bankrupt, how morally bankrupt, how psychologically bankrupt everything sort of is. But anyway, and I do think in some sense that's because the culture is pushing the boundaries, and the hard we don't have the knowledge, but also we don't have the hard power. So we don't have the knowledge of the soft power that fixes the problem, and we don't, in terms of, I think psychology is an important piece of that puzzle, and we don't have the certain legal traditions and legal systems are just fundamentally, they are overtly the rule of man, and in some sense then people have imprinted that into their thinking. They have been imprinted by the fact that they know that they live in a society where the rule of law is not the rule of law, it's the rule of man, and it's fundamentally arbitrary, and so it's basically a power game. It's something like a Game of Thrones. And there's a kind of narcissism to that, and there is also a kind of borderline sort of reflection of that kind of game playing as well, which is a very toxic kind of borderline. Anyway, because it just never bootstraps its own responsibility and management for its own outcomes. It never ever does that because it knows it can get away with it. Uh, because the social conventions and the social pressures, there's too much beliefs that are there to be manipulated, that are there to kind of be narratively activated, or whatever, or plugged into, or mobilized, or weaponized, just by kind of doing the right amount of legwork of messing with the context, um, to activate that kind of peanut gallery sort of function. And a lot of people have, in some sense, also been at the receiving end of that kind of trauma of having that moral authority mobilized against them, and then they have kind of gotten with the program in some sense. Agent Smith is probably a really good archetypal figure in that wise, in that kind of vein. He's kind of, in some modern political analogy, he's kind of like the proto fascist third wave feminist. Agent Smith is a proto fascist third wave feminist. He's a misanthrope. He's misanthropic. He doesn't just hate humans, he also hates his own kind. He wants them. Because why should he be the enforcer of a system that is based on corruption? Everyone should be the same. He should assimilate the humans and all the computers. Everyone should all be this mediated middle ground in some sense. In some sense, he's kind of like the archetypal rainbow Führer, mediating between all different identities and making them all the same. Anyway, uh, what's the point here? So now let me move on to say that. So I am speculating about whether some people, I mean, de facto, it might be true that some people just they won't maybe they won't crucify themselves, but I am speculating also that people that can successfully crucify themselves, they might not have the capacity to keep clean their own borderline gateway filter between the unconscious and the ego. And in fact, in some sense, maybe we're all defective in that way as well. Maybe everyone has a kind of break point, maybe, or a kind of pressure point in which you lose yourself, you lose your sanity, uh, I mean, I do actually think that Star Trek is kind of the best that we can do, and it's not as if people not only make mistakes in Star Trek, but they also sometimes fall from grace. And then they have to kind of regain their composure. But obviously these are kind of like radical sort of things. I mean, the famous example of this in Star Trek: The Next Generation was when Jean-Luc Picard was broken by torture, and he saw three lights. Uh, his subconscious actually underwrit, or that's not the right exact word, but undermined and in some sense fractured his own, the seal between his subconscious and his unconscious uh, was broken from the other side, was broken from the subconscious side of things, that it took control, which kind of created, well, I mean, if I'm going to analogize from that and say that the people in Star Trek are crucifying themselves, they are evolved humans, they have evolved psyches, and in some sense, again, I think that the way to be evolved is, on a cultural level, is to have a proper courthouse and to have a proper field of psychology. I think, I kind of connotated this even in a recording quite a while ago when I was criticizing some of. I mean, I can't say that too harshly. He's a very insightful intellectual, but when I was giving my views on Sam Vaknin's take on uh, the cultural relativism of psychology, and I was saying that no, it can be canonized, it can be universalized, but it does require a kind of political commitment to a particular political philosophy, and there is, and then I make the point that there is a right one and there is a wrong one, and then every time Sam Vaknin says that Anglo-Saxon, British political liberalism that was invented by the Anglo-Saxons is just a kind of historical blip in the a fly in his ointment, and so that he can get back to his kind of determinism and his kind of lowest common denominator geographical extrapolation of almost a kind of Marxist analysis of dialectical materialism throughout history or something like that. Although I mean perhaps slightly more broader than that, but much in the same general vein. But well, Sam Vaknin certainly, in terms of almost what I was saying about subtractions, he is a very keen thinker, and in that way, a lot of his fruitfulness in his thought are very prescient, important insights, and they are very important subtracted systems and such, uh, or subsystems, and different there are different ways to cut the cake, as it were, but uh, I think he gets some very fine slices that have really good cross sections through the whole matter, that if are just reprocessed, which I try to reprocess them and put them into my schema, obviously. And I disagree with his somewhat amoralism, but I do think that perhaps he's trying to play the role of an expert, of an academic expert, and then you can't sort of play favorites, and he wants as broad an audience as possible in some sense. So he doesn't want to sort of play partisan politics with his what could be a further reaching, kind of impactful intellectual contribution, I guess. Um, anyway, what's my point here? Is that so I was talking about my argument with Sam Vaknin because of liberalism versus determinism and how we can have proper values. I mean, if we don't do that, you see, I'm basically saying, like Nietzsche was completely correct when he said, God is dead and no amount of water will ever wash away the blood. And in some sense, the only way that we can justify that has happened, that did happen, so we cannot resurrect God. But what we can do is we can build a courthouse. And we can build a unitary faith structure that is justifiable in a secular sense because half of it is in psychology and the other half of it is in the legal structure and the legal theory. And you're allowed to rebel against the psychological side of it, but you can't do so by lying. You can't do so by, so, and in some sense we haven't kind of properly answered the psychology, I mean, sometimes psychology isn't even trying because you can't, you're not going to come up with, you're not going to discover the true psychological structures. In some sense, they're looking in the wrong place. They're looking in the brain. They're not looking in philosophy. They're not looking in phenomenology. They're trying to find maybe a biological, physiological substrate to phenomenology. It's really stupid. They don't know what they're looking for. They don't know what they should be looking for because they don't have enough sort of metaphysical structure. They don't have enough. Their theory isn't sophisticated enough to give them enough. We actually need psyche literally comes from the word spirit. But anyway, we need to understand quite robustly the immaterial structure of what we're dealing with from a philosophical standpoint, and then we'll be able to find some mirror representation of it in the physiology. But at some point, I do think Roger Penrose is largely correct that essentially it's all somewhat, it obviously it's not like quantum magic in some sense. There are physical repositories of, let's say, habitual tendency and proclivity that is somewhat banked into a physical hard copy, but how that is being accessed or how that is being evaluated in cognitive processes is that it's something like, because there's quite a broad range in which something may or may not trigger, and that the extent to which that there is that call it play of triggering that, I don't know all the biological words, triggering that neuron or not triggering that neuron because of the, in some sense there are bits of data that are held in the thing that looks like the root structure or whatever, is then going to manifest as that, well, whether it triggers or not, there's a higher band of variance of whether it triggers or not. And in some sense, then when you put these in serial and you put these in connection and network, and when these things are firing as a network, you've got a certain level of intellectual choice, which in some sense is being promulgated, I guess you could say, on the quantum level or something like that. And I don't want to get into this too much because I do actually think that a lot of my psychological models are effectively are actually probably are very similar to quantum mechanics, because all the emotional tones, all the four field circuits, are all of them in some sense relatable to the six spins in some atomic particles, because they each have 6 things. And even the difference between, because there are two categories of these emotional tones, which are inflections of the inflections of a certain kind of extraction from the 17 model. Anyway, I'm not going to get into all this. I do talk about this, or at least some of the mechanical side on the psychology side, not explicitly comparing it to quantum mechanics, but I do think that it's probably similar. In the same way that magnetism and electric activity is metaphorically quite the same between what in alchemy, the the magnetic fluid and the electric fluid, which is basically in my 17 model as well. But some sense the quantum stuff is not in the 17 model, it's in the 12 model, it's in the metagram circuitry model, it's in the unconscious field circuits. So anyway, that's interesting that essentially all of these things can, I think, probably be very easily analogized to spin. And so some spins have certain properties in how they transmit energy to other types of spin, and then how there's a kind of systemic resonance that can induce or affect what else is connected in that field circuit or something like that. But anyway, and it's interesting as well, because then essentially the way that one field circuit relates to somebody else's field circuit or to a different field circuit is through an individual. So in some sense, the field circuit can be said to be a kind of collective mass of individuals, but then through the individual, one field circuit can have transmutated through the individual an application from the one field circuit into another field circuit. So people are almost like the conduits of how the 4 field circuits are and it's interesting as well, because in Revelations there is obviously there's a correlating archetype to this, which is the 4 creatures on the throne. They're like these 4 animals, which each have 4 heads or something like that. It's very interesting, on the throne, or beside the throne or around the throne of God, and then they say that it says in Revelation something like the creatures say all the time, hallelujah, praise be to the one most high, or something like that. That's all they do, these 4 creatures. And that is in some sense how the dream of St. John at Patmos is describing the end of the world, which is not the end of, it's the end of your world. It's not the end of because the world itself is not a physical thing. It's a psychological somewhat category. This is all sort of metaphysical consciousness sort of stuff. But anyway, let me say, yeah. So anyway, I was just, let me emphasize a point that I made maybe in one recording ago, or maybe it was also in this recording, that in some sense you don't have a golden metagram circuit at any point relative to the field circuits, but you might have a golden circuit relative to another individual. And that is something that is, in some sense, you can't justify that in relation to the field circuit, because there's no justification in relation to the field circuit. You can give your gold circuitry and have it attached to the rest of the field circuits, but the field circuits are never happy to think of you anything other than just another iron conductor. You are iron relative to the field circuit. Relative to the animal, they're all just more animals. The animal just sees another kind of animal. Maybe it's the same kind of animal as it, but it's just another animal. So anyway, what's my point here? My point here is just that the goldness of it is that, and this comes out very clearly in the scripture when it says, "For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, so that we may live through." I'm kind of probably butchering it a bit, but the point here is that kind of in the same vein, and I believe very close to that, maybe in the same chapter, it says that about forgiveness to the world, that essentially that part of what the Christ consciousness is that you are granting forgiveness to the world. You are giving forgiveness to the world. But this is so important to understand. The world cannot receive it. You are giving forgiveness to the field circuits, but the field circuits cannot receive it. They do. You give them gold, and it takes it as just more iron. It's just more iron to the field circuit. And in some sense, the only thing that you can do with these field circuit creatures is you can just kind of, uh, you know, it's that, you can kind of uh, get on with them. You can have good relations to them in some sense, but it's not another human. It's like a conduit. It's the medium, the karmic medium through which transcendental energy, the waves of transcendental energy are carried through that medium. So in some sense, the flesh, we are all just animals to one another in this objective third party point of view in terms of the field circuit. So, in some sense, but that's not a human perspective. That's not a subjective perspective. That's not the proper perspective to have. That's the perspective of the flesh in some sense. And so this is why flesh and blood will not inherit the kingdom, because the kingdom is made up of flesh. The kingdom is made out of flesh and blood. And it does take blood to achieve Christ consciousness. It comes by blood, not just by water. And this means here that this seal of the borderline seal, there might be a kind of, to put it like this, maybe it's a kind of a blood curse, and in some sense that's a horrible sort of metaphor in some sense. Let me try to clean this up, not to frighten people, is that the blood curse in some sense, and let me symbolically break this down, because there's probably a much better metaphor than that, might be, and I really am speculating here, that some metatypes are just fundamentally, that their borderline gateway might get into a good enough state relative to other people that they will seem to be crucifying themselves. But in some sense, maybe they can't tell if they are or if they aren't, but they are kind of only saved by people around them that have the right hard and soft structures to kind of keep them on the rails, to kind of keep them on, so that they can just know, okay, well, I'm following the law, and I'm following the best practice that psychology tells me, or something like that. They need an instruction manual or something like that, because of the particular constituents of the cognitive physiology of their ego. It just might be that in some sense they don't attain to faith. They can't. Faith is part of their subconscious, maybe. I mean, there are metatypes in which literally the 13th dimension is bound up in the subconscious. So these are kind of metaphysical questions that I have not. I mean, I have. This has been a problem in MBTI for as long as the field has almost existed. The idea of natural hierarchy, the idea of natural superiority, in some sense, that it should not be the case that some types are just naturally greater or better than other types. That is a kind of, that somehow our general bleeding-hearted sympathy will not tolerate that. And in some sense, I don't necessarily buy that, because there are two reasons for that. I mean, I think about what my grandmother always used to say, and I think there's something to this, and I've also tried to think about this in some sense, that she always used to tell me about some of her friends who had these strange, interesting beliefs and things like that, and all the people that had all these interesting beliefs from her Catholic school and stuff like that, and she always told me, well, some people, she had a friend that told her that really believed this, that she said some people are angels, some people literally are angels, as if to say, like, they're not humans, they're angels. And I think that there might be something to that. I think that that might be something like what the goats are like, and in some sense, I'm not gonna replay the kind of at conception, when genetics is happening, when the chromosomes are forming, that already then there is perhaps a blood bond. There is already a kind of a bloodline limit, even sometimes, that there is a certain metatype that is locked in, that already you are. And when I say that, I don't mean like that's an accident. That is your incarnation. That I'm not saying, oh, okay, that is your incarnation. That's not like an accident of birth. Like, you are the thought, you are the thinking cognitive process. That, I mean, I think that thoughts are happening as the chromosomes are swirling into alignment, into encoding. That is a meditation of conception. And in some sense, I think there is, what's happening is that there's a lineage there as well. And this is, I don't want to get too sort of weird. Um, but, the sins of the father are visited on this, the sins of the parents. I should perhaps look at the scripture more specifically, but be interesting. I used to know so much about genetics that I've forgotten about it now, but so in my half ignorance and in my groping in my spiritual conjecture, I mean, there are very interesting things in lineage which are explored in many religions. Islam, very famously, but it's also quite explicitly in the Old Testament, that, the sons of women who have many fathers, a daughter of many fathers, will have children of great renown. Who are these women that have many fathers? The many-fathered daughter has herself children of great renown. It's a very interesting sort of thing. I mean, it's grounded in the masculine in some senses, the source of the spirit of the child of great renown, perhaps. But the conduit that, let's say, condenses all of that is the woman. That in some sense there is this idea that the masculine is the active, but the feminine is the container, the repository, the vessel that substance accumulates in. I mean, in some sense, famously, the egg, the sperm goes inside the egg. The egg is the container, is the vessel. Um, and in some sense, this egg is a something. I mean, I guess of an amalgamate of some kind of experience that has condensed, that has. It is the synthesis of, it is it is an alchemy. Um, anyway, I don't, because it's interesting. or it's also a little bit frightening, you know, sort of getting into the kind of the eugenics that has happened differentially in different cultures and different traditions and different religions. I wondered if I should bring up the Ezekiel thing again. Um, the values and the wheels within wheels. Um, I had another sort of resolution to what's going on there. But I did think I actually dealt with that very poetically. I think it's in this string of recordings that I think I said it, which will be all amalgamated together. But you know how you go from. I mean, I wanted to add this point to it to kind of emphasize it, that it's not the fact that, for example, that if there is a problem in the community, that then a child is born that is the answer to the problem. That in some sense the spiritual procreation, that in some sense that if the parents are sitting with some kind of maybe unconscious stress even, and then that leads to some kind of sexual energy, that creative energy, that procreative energy, that maybe they don't have to have a child, but maybe by their synthesis embodied energy, that they can symbolically, metaphysically, let's say, get a clue as to the solution of this, because in some sense that's what women and men are doing relative to each other often, is that they are specializing and they are playing to their strengths. And so the unification of that insight is that they are scanning the field for different things, and they also have probably a different circuitry, a different metagram circuitry, even if they have the same metatype. I, I mean, I'll have to look at that, but I wonder how, if people actually do ever couple with their own metagram circuit, because that would be an interesting case to maybe look at what that circuit looks like, and if there might be a starting way to kind of get into the research of working out what all these different types mean, and the different sort of potentialities and the different capacities of the different types, and the limits of self-actualization, perhaps, because in some sense that's kind of what I'm vaguely getting into. Because I mean, I do actually believe that I am self-actualized now, but I know that I'm not perfect. uh, and in some sense I can probably do better in my life by understanding other people's psychology better, by understanding at least the variety of different types of personality styles out there, the different types of what the different metatypes mean, and also what the different metatypes are likely to be troubled by, because each metatype, I think, generally vaguely will replicate the same kind of drama, but depending on the metagram circuitry, that drama will manifest potentially through a huge variety of expression, but also some metagram types might be more variant in their various expressions than others, or manifestations of pathology. I mean, I believe also that if my work might eventually be integrated into medicine, it might be very easy to work out through some technology, even maybe it's even correlated to a combination of genetic markers and blood type, who knows, but or facial expressions. But I have always thought that there are too many uncanny resemblances between people that have the same metatype or the same metagram circuitry, that they physiologically, they seem to have the same hormone profile to create such similar physiology. And also, I'll add as well that you just have to talk to enough medical specialists and professionals that they will often get someone sitting in their chair because they have been referred by somebody else for specialized testing or something like that. And if they haven't even looked at the case before, they haven't opened the file from what the doctor has said, and they look at this person in their chair, they can already guess what's wrong with this person because they fit a stereotype. and they know what that stereotype looks like. And there's always someone who has the same personality and the same physiology, and they always have the same physical. Specialists see this quite a bit, like obviously there's some things that are much easier to diagnose than others, but other specialities and illnesses that are more, what's the word, that are less conspicuous, like, some kinds of cancers, you don't even, uh, you wouldn't even know the person was sick and they're suffering from cancer. They don't look out of shape even, and they're suffering from cancer. And that's what I mean when you're dealing with specialists, and they can almost guess quite reliably what the problem is, just based on stereotype, or based on a common thread, a common theme, as it were, because they keep on seeing the same stereotype presenting the same pathological dysfunction. And obviously this is not to say that everyone with the same metagram is going to have the same medical problem. I mean, I would almost love to get a hold of one of these socialized medicine people countries, because a lot of those places that are rich in Europe, they do genetic profiling on their whole population, and they've already stored up a wealth of information of correlating um, illness and disease with genetic markers. So something like that would be ripe, perhaps, for me to go and investigate. But anyway, I mean, I should finish psychology before I get into medicine, probably. But anyways, it's very interesting. But so I have an inkling of something like that. But there's ample scripture as well. When it talks about that God will search the entrails and the liver and the kidneys, and I can't remember the other organs that it says, but it says, this is a God that actually will judge you by, in some sense, I mean, in the Eastern sense, you would say by the chakra held by your organs, and the dysfunction and the disharmony of your internal, you know you know the mind body connection. I mean, even medical science must admit that essentially, the placebo effect is probably, if you could directly harness the placebo effect, it would be hands down almost the strongest medicine, um, to harness. I mean, if medical research and medical everything has taught us nothing, it's that the placebo effect does work remarkably well. Um, it's almost the best medicine. Almost, probably. In most cases, it probably is. Um, Especially in terms of preventative medicine. But anyway, let me move on. So what else shall I say now? Yeah, so just about this golden circuit not being a golden circuit relative to the field circuits, that's an interesting sort of thing. And then you have to be very careful of people that are seeing things from the perspective of the field circuit. And I do think that there might be some types that are maybe incapable of doing anything other than kind of naturalizing and homogenizing their own egoic. Well, I mean, that might be a kind of a particular toxic sort of 4.5, Keegan stage 4.5, in which their dominant function is basically creating a mirror of the borderline gateway filter, and is through the kind of the reflection of the borderline gateway filter is kind of idolizing something about a field circuit, but there just might be like not enough capacity within the ego to even kind of undercut or kind of get around that mechanism. It might be kind of bound there, maybe might be kind of in, it might be like a fundamental intransigence, and because of the metagram circuitry, because it's like I haven't explored this in my recordings well enough, but metagram circuitry is a bitch. Metagram circuitry puts a spanner in the wrench of metatype. Like and this is also I need to kind of create a better way to model metagram as an overlay onto my metatype structure, because the metatype structure is very interesting and useful, but in some sense it's a bit too simplistic, because the metagram circuitry is in particular, it kind of messes up metatype, which in some sense doesn't matter, because you can at some point, or this is the problem, if you can close the door, or you can sort of, that's you need a kind of one-way flow regulator on the borderline gateway between the unconscious and the ego. But I wonder if that it might be impossible for some people to manage, or at least not without a kind of cultural societal shift first. So that's a fundamental problem. Uh, and again, like some people, I wonder if they just, I mean, tamasic subtypes might also be at a particular disadvantage, because they will have a natural proclivity to be weighted within their unconscious side of the mind, and they will not even be honest and genuine and forthright about their own sort of reticence, because they are so grounded and anchored into their unconscious side of the mind. Um, and in some sense, the problem with tamas is that their actual full metagram circuit is even very lopsided, because it, as soon as it reaches up to one of the points at which it is undermining its own validity, it like does it in a half-assed way. So the circuit itself is very um, prone to maldevelopment and malformation, which makes it incredibly unwieldy and difficult for it to kind of own its own. In some sense, you know, the whole theme is growing responsibility. Um, and in this way, like some people, the tragedy of some people's lives, you know, Matthew McConaughey, oh my word, I hope I got his name right, the Australian actor who had a very troubled childhood. He was interviewed recently. Is it Matthew McConaughey? I'm so bad with names. He was interviewed by Michaela Peterson recently. He's really an amazing guy, and he's done some very valiant things in standing up against the political corruption as well. But you know, in his own humble and authentic way, and you know, just writing a book about his own life. He's a very interesting character, very tragic circumstances. You know, really salt of the earth kind of guy. You know, he's a guy who's actually he was you know from uh, it's interesting because I mean I guess sadly you need someone with that kind of tragic past who can stand up against the social justice stuff, because when they say, well, you just have white male privilege, you know, it's like, have you read my biography? You know, it's that kind of or autobiography or something. You know, it's and it just shows you almost the difference between a kind of an authentic soul and someone who is like literally just trying to kind of coattail on some kind of cultural, conventional, you know, sort of mob mentality, some kind of disgusting identitarian slander, and you know, sort of. I mean, you know, I even recently in the exchange between Jonathan Pageau, Pageau, I hope I'm saying that right, and Evan Julian Evans, I believe is his name. I hope I got his. I hope, or it's Evan Julian. Oh, damn! It's even worse. I keep on. I keep on. I feel so bad because he certainly seemed to say a lot of very interesting things, even though I disagreed with almost half of what he said, probably. Or at least I would qualify it differently. But I did push back against some of his things about New Ageism, because he doesn't believe that it's all proto-fascism, and in some sense, I link that to the issue of sexuality. I think quite well, because I do think that it, in some sense, fascism is always made up of sublimated sexual energy. Um, I would say Christianity is one of the only sort of doctrines that actually is trying to end the mystery of these things. Well, I mean, obviously not in traditional Christian continental Catholicism, perhaps, but at least, well, I would say the true teaching of the doctrine or something like that is not afraid to get down to the bottom of these things. In some sense, in the context of the communion, perhaps, where it's necessary to be worked out, as which is especially happening when you are taking people's prophecy, the gift of the prophet, from the members in the church, and and you're taking their dreams and you're taking their visions. Um, it's very interesting the things that come out. Anyway, and often the sort of the trauma underlying a lot of these things. But my point is that I was just going to make that point about Julian Evans, I believe, hopefully, is that I think the reason why there is this great propensity for New Ageism to kind of eventually evolve or adapt quite quickly, even to set up the structures of a kind of proto-fascism, is because instead of trying to ground the sexual energy into the truth, they are trying to build a kind of Tower of Babel out of it, and they don't have a good enough spiritual practice to kind of crucify the bullshit out of their self-indulgence. So because they're mixing practices up, and they don't perhaps have the right practices, and they don't have the sort of the right kind of well-structured, kind of mythology, or I mean, this is the brilliance of Christianity, is that, if you actually come into remembrance of the whole doctrine, and you are trying to integrate it all and trying to understand it all, and actually say, well, everything in the Bible in fact is true, we need to understand how it all comes together and agrees with itself, and if until we do that, we know that we don't know what we're doing and we haven't done it right. When you have that mind about it, then you do make discovery and you do add and you do integrate. But I mean, it is problematic because, sometimes if you can't integrate something, then maybe you've made a mistake and you have to go back and revise. And then you can't kind of do it piecemeal, I would say. It's actually, you need, um, you can't sort of cobble it together, I don't think. You do actually kind of need to pretty much have the understanding and then read it and then confirm, yeah, this is the truth. Or, this is true understanding of these subjects in some sense. Um, and so like a lot of people, you know, it's not, I don't think the scriptures offer inspiration. Uh, Except for the dreams. I think the dreams, or the dream of St. John at Patmos, that's probably the only exception. Because the whole book of Revelations is a dream. And that's what dreams are for. Um, they need to be interpreted. Um, and all the other dreams that are already interpreted in the scripture, those obviously are not for inspiration, but they're there to give a tangible example of a dream, and then a priest or someone with the gift of the priest that interpreted the dream, or something like that. Um, I guess it can't just. It's not necessarily a priest that can. That's perhaps a bit too much of a sort of generic thing. Um, yeah, anyway, well, no, I guess you could say, it can be amalgamated with the other spiritual gifts that you're bringing to bear over the situation. In some sense, I think, sometimes the dreams are not for the people that even have the dreams. They're for a third person. They're for somebody else, or they're for perhaps a message to the person that it has been brought to their attention, or something like that. Anyway, I'm kind of babbling a bit. Did I cover everything that I wanted to cover? Oh, so I was talking about the fascistic sexual energy. Yeah, and I think I also went into wonderful detail about that, about how the social justice whole thing is built out of the excavation of the dehumanization of male sexual energy, um, and the depersonalization of, you know, of these kinds of slanders like toxic masculinity. I mean, in some sense, it's very much the same vogue, the same process of the conspiracy theory against the Jews in Weimar Germany, which led obviously to the Third Reich, to the Nazi state. Okay, so shall I stop this recording finally? I think I covered everything that I wanted to cover, and now I'm rambling a bit too much, but I did want to finish this point, but I've gotten tired. I mean, the last 2 days I've probably made like 8 hours of voice recordings. It's a bit ridiculous. I should slow down. And I also need to finish a point. Well, I need to make another recording that I promised, in some sense, in my sexuality recording. Or maybe I should just go and be active on the Good Looking Loser website and see actually what they are actually doing there and all the things that are going on there, rather than talk about it in the abstract.